Something happened last night that you were never supposed to hear about this soon. A name was mentioned, a question was asked, and for a moment, everything became completely silent because someone in the room suddenly realized that the secret they had been protecting was no longer safe. Your soulmate was caught last night, but the shocking part is not simply that they were seen, it is who they were with. Because the person standing beside them was someone you would never have expected to be there, and when the truth began to unfold, your soulmate did not immediately defend themselves. They stood there quietly, as though they knew that sooner or later this moment would arrive. Someone saw them, someone recognized them, and someone noticed the expression on their face. It wasn't the expression of a person enjoying a secret night out, it wasn't the expression of someone celebrating, it was the expression of someone carrying a decision that had become too heavy to hide. The night had already become unusually quiet when your soulmate left. They told themselves they were only going somewhere for a short time. They thought nobody would notice, they thought they could return before anyone started asking questions. But sometimes the smallest decision opens the door to a truth that has been waiting for months, and that is exactly what happened. Your soulmate went somewhere they had been hesitant to visit. They arrived alone, at least, that is what everyone believed. Then another person appeared, and the moment your soulmate saw them, something changed, their posture changed, their expression changed. They looked around before sitting down, almost as if they were afraid someone might recognize them. But they were not meeting this person for the reason you might immediately imagine. There was something much deeper happening, something emotional, something connected to you, and before the night was over, your name entered the conversation. That is the part that changes everything, because you were not physically there, but somehow you became the center of the conversation. Your soulmate had been trying to make sense of what they felt. They had been carrying questions they didn't know how to answer. They had been replaying memories. They had been remembering things you said, things you didn't say, moments that seemed insignificant at the time but somehow became impossible to forget, and the person sitting across from them knew there was something wrong. They asked, "Why are you really here?" Your soulmate didn't answer immediately. They looked down, they took a breath, then they finally said something that revealed more than they intended. They said they were confused, not about you, about themselves, because every time they tried to move forward, something inside them pulled them back toward the truth they had been avoiding. They had convinced themselves that distance would make things easier. They thought time would erase the feelings. They believed that if they stayed busy enough, surrounded themselves with enough people, and kept their mind occupied, eventually the thoughts of you would disappear. But they didn't. Instead, they became stronger, and last night, they finally admitted that. The person sitting with them asked the question your soulmate had been afraid to answer. Do you still think about them? There was a long silence, and then your soulmate nodded. That one small movement said everything. They still thought about you. They still wondered what you were doing. They still wondered whether you had moved on. They still wondered whether you remembered the moments you shared. But there was something else. They were afraid that they had waited too long. They were afraid that their silence had already cost them the opportunity to tell you what they truly felt. and the person sitting across from them knew it. That person wasn't necessarily a rival. That person wasn't secretly stealing your soulmate away. That person was someone who knew enough about the situation to understand what your soulmate had been hiding, someone who had been watching the story unfold from the outside, someone who had finally decided to tell them the truth. You need to stop running. Those words hit your soulmate harder than anything else that night, because deep down, they knew it was true. They had been running from the conversation, running from their emotions, running from the possibility of rejection, running from the fear that if they finally told you everything, they might discover that you no longer felt the same way, and that fear had controlled them for longer than they wanted to admit. But then something unexpected happened. The person they were with asked about you directly. They asked what made you different. Your soulmate smiled. It was a small smile, almost involuntary, and that smile revealed the answer. They couldn't explain exactly what made you different. They couldn't put it into one sentence. It wasn't simply your appearance. It wasn't simply the things you said. It wasn't one particular memory. It was the way they felt when they were around you. The way ordinary moments seemed more meaningful. The way silence didn't always feel uncomfortable. The way they could remember tiny details about you without trying. The way your absence could be felt even in a crowded room. And then they admitted something they had never said aloud before. They were afraid that you were becoming too important to them. The person across from them looked at them carefully. Then why haven't you told them? Your soulmate had no answer, because the truth was painful. They were afraid. They were afraid of hearing no. They were afraid of being vulnerable. They were afraid that their past mistakes would become more important than their intentions. They were afraid that you would ask questions they weren't ready to answer. And most of all, they were afraid that you might already be healing without them. That possibility frightened them more than they wanted anyone to know. But the night wasn't finished, because while this conversation was happening, someone else noticed them, someone who knew your soulmate, someone who recognized the person sitting beside them, and suddenly, the secret meeting wasn't a secret anymore. A message was sent, a question was raised. Who are they with? The answer came quickly. Your soulmate, and someone else. For a moment, people began making assumptions. They imagined the worst. They wondered whether your soulmate had been hiding another relationship. They wondered whether there was a secret you needed to know. They wondered whether the person beside your soulmate was someone who had become important to them. But assumptions are dangerous when you don't know the whole story, because what looked suspicious from the outside was completely different on the inside. The meeting wasn't about replacing you. It was about understanding what your soulmate was going to do about you. That is why the night became so emotional. Your soulmate was finally being confronted with a decision: keep hiding, or tell the truth, and for the first time, they realized they couldn't continue living between those two choices. They had to choose. The person with them told them something simple: if you care about them, stop making them guess. Your soulmate became quiet. Those words stayed with them, because perhaps that was the real problem. You had been left guessing. Guessing what they felt, guessing whether they cared, guessing whether their silence meant rejection, guessing whether their distance meant the connection was over, and while you were left wondering. Your soulmate had been having their own private battle. They had been wondering about you too. They wondered whether you were angry, whether you had stopped believing in the connection, whether you had decided to close the door completely. And last night, that fear became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate took out their phone. They opened your conversation. They looked at your name. They stared at the screen. But they didn't send anything. Not yet. Their finger hovered over the message box. They typed something, deleted it, typed again, deleted it again. The person beside them watched silently. Then they asked, "What are you afraid to say?" Your soulmate finally answered, "I'm afraid they won't believe me." That sentence carried years of hesitation, because perhaps your soulmate knew that words alone would not be enough. If they had disappeared before, words would not erase the silence. If they had made promises before, another promise might not be convincing. If they had hurt you through distance or confusion, simply saying, "I care," might not repair everything. They understood that. And that is why the next decision mattered. They decided that if they came toward you again, they couldn't come with half-truths. They couldn't come with excuses. They couldn't come expecting you to forget everything instantly. They would have to be honest. Completely honest, and that meant admitting what they had been hiding. They still cared. They still thought about you. They still wondered whether there was a future between you, and they were tired of pretending otherwise. The person who had been sitting with them finally stood up. The meeting was ending, but before leaving, they turned back and said something your soulmate would remember. Don't wait until you lose them to realize what you should have said. Your soulmate looked down, and for several seconds, nobody spoke. Then your soulmate nodded. The night outside was cold and quiet. They walked away slowly, but something had changed. They were no longer walking away from the truth. They were walking toward it, and that is why the question, "Who were they with?" has an answer that may surprise you. They were with someone who forced them to confront their feelings, someone who knew enough to challenge their excuses, someone who refused to let them keep hiding behind fear. The person beside them wasn't the main story. Your soulmate was. Because what happened inside that conversation revealed what your soulmate had been unwilling to admit. You were still on their mind. Your name still carried emotion. Your memory still had power. And their biggest fear wasn't losing their freedom. It wasn't being alone. It wasn't starting over. Their biggest fear was discovering that they had waited until you were no longer waiting. That realization followed them home. They couldn't sleep. They looked at the clock. They walked from one room to another. They picked up their phone again. They opened your conversation, and this time, they began typing something longer, something more honest, something they had wanted to say for a long time. They wrote about regret. They wrote about confusion. They wrote about the moments they remembered. They wrote about the things they should have said. Then they stopped. Because suddenly they realized that sending a message at that hour might not be enough. Maybe you deserved more than a late-night confession. Maybe you deserved to hear the truth face to face. So they saved the message. They didn't send it, but they didn't delete it either. And that matters. because sometimes the moment before someone finally speaks is the moment when everything inside them changes. Your soulmate had spent so long believing that silence protected them. Last night, they realized silence had only created more distance. They had mistaken avoidance for peace. They had mistaken fear for wisdom. They had mistaken waiting for patience, and now they were beginning to understand the difference. There is another part of the story that you may not expect. The person your soulmate met last night apparently knew something about you too, not a secret, not something dangerous. Something simple. They knew how much your presence had affected your soulmate. They had seen the difference in your soulmate whenever your name came up. They had noticed the way your soulmate became quieter. They had noticed the way certain memories could change their mood. And they finally said something that your soulmate could not ignore. You don't talk about them like someone you're over. Your soulmate looked away, because there was no argument against that. They weren't over you. Maybe they had tried to convince themselves otherwise. Maybe they had told other people they were fine. Maybe they had even told themselves they were fine. But last night, the truth finally became too obvious. They weren't fine. They were conflicted. They were emotional. They were afraid. And somewhere beneath all of that was hope. Hope that maybe the story wasn't finished. Hope that maybe there was still a conversation waiting to happen. Hope that maybe you hadn't completely closed your heart to the possibility of hearing them out. But your soulmate also understood something important. Hope does not give someone the right to demand another person's attention, if they wanted another chance. They would have to earn your trust. They would have to respect your choices. They would have to show through actions that their intentions were real. That was the lesson last night. Not that destiny would magically fix everything. Not that you were required to wait. Not that you had to accept someone simply because they returned. The lesson was that truth matters. Honesty matters, and sometimes people only understand what they truly want when they finally become brave enough to admit what they have been avoiding. Your soulmate left that meeting with one clear thought: they needed to talk to you. Not tomorrow because someone told them to. Not because they were lonely. Not because they were afraid of seeing you move on. But because you deserved the truth. And somewhere between midnight and morning, they made a decision. They would stop hiding behind uncertainty. They would stop allowing other people to speak for them. They would stop pretending that the connection meant nothing. They would tell you what happened. They would tell you who they were with. They would tell you why they went there. And they would finally tell you what they had been feeling. But there is one final detail from last night that makes the entire situation even more interesting. Before they left, the person they met asked one last question. If they asked you right now whether you still loved them, what would you say? Your soulmate didn't answer immediately. They looked toward the window. They took a deep breath. Then they said quietly, "I would finally tell the truth," and that was the moment everything changed. Because the secret wasn't really about who they were with. The real secret was why they went there. They went because they were searching for courage. They went because they needed someone to challenge them. They went because they were tired of carrying feelings they had never properly expressed, and they left with a decision. Now the next part belongs to the future. You don't have to chase anyone. You don't have to force a conversation. You don't have to convince anyone of your worth. You don't have to put your life on hold. If your soulmate truly wants to return, they will have to approach you honestly and respectfully. They will have to show you through their actions that they mean what they say. And if that moment comes, you will be allowed to take your time. You will be allowed to ask questions. You will be allowed to listen carefully. You will be allowed to decide what is right for you. Because the most powerful part of this story isn't that your soulmate was caught last night. It is that they were finally caught by the truth. They could no longer hide from their own feelings. They could no longer pretend that everything was simple. They could no longer tell themselves that avoiding the conversation would make the emotions disappear. Something happened last night. A conversation happened. A truth surfaced. A decision was made. And somewhere in the quiet hours before morning, your soulmate looked at your name on their screen one more time. They didn't know what your response would be. They didn't know whether you would answer. They didn't know whether you would believe them. But for the first time, they were willing to accept that uncertainty, because being honest was becoming more important than being comfortable. And that is where the story stands now. Not at the end. Not at the beginning. But at the moment just before someone finally opens the door they were once too afraid to touch. Your soulmate was caught last night, but perhaps they were not caught with another person in the way everyone assumed. Perhaps they were caught confronting the one person they had been avoiding for the longest time. Themselves. And when morning arrived, the message they had written during the night was still sitting there, waiting. 3 words appeared at the beginning. I need to. Then they stopped. They stared at the screen. They erased the sentence. And started again. This time, they wrote something different. Something more honest. Something they had been trying to say for far too long. And just before they pressed send, they whispered your name. Then their finger moved toward the screen, and that is where the night ended. The message was still sitting on the screen when morning arrived. Your soulmate had written it, erased it, rewritten it, and stared at it so many times that the words no longer looked real. They knew they couldn't hide forever. But they also knew that pressing send could change everything, because once the truth was spoken, there would be no way to take it back. The strange thing was that the person they had met the night before had warned them about exactly this moment. They had said, "You keep waiting for the perfect moment, but the perfect moment doesn't exist." Those words had followed your soulmate home. They had heard them while driving. They had heard them while walking through the quiet streets. They had heard them when they finally sat alone with their phone in their hand. And now they were hearing them again. Your soulmate looked at your name. They thought about the first time they realized you mattered more than they expected. They remembered conversations they had replayed hundreds of times. They remembered moments when they wanted to say something but chose silence. They remembered opportunities they allowed to pass. And suddenly, one painful realization became impossible to escape. They had spent too much time waiting for certainty. They wanted to know exactly how you would respond before they ever took the risk of being honest. But love, connection, trust, and forgiveness do not come with guarantees. Sometimes you have to speak honestly and allow another person the freedom to choose what happens next. Your soulmate finally understood that, so they began typing again. This time, They didn't try to make themselves sound perfect. They didn't create excuses. They didn't blame circumstances. They didn't pretend they had everything figured out. They simply told the truth. They admitted they had been confused. They admitted they had been afraid. They admitted that there were moments when they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves. They admitted that they had wondered whether you still thought about them. And then they admitted something even more difficult. They were sorry. Not because someone had caught them, not because the secret meeting had been discovered. They were sorry because they realized that their silence may have caused you to question your own importance, and that was never what they wanted. They wanted you to know that their distance was never proof that you meant nothing. Sometimes people pull away from something important because they are frightened by how much it matters. That doesn't make the distance harmless. It doesn't erase the confusion, but it explains why your soulmate had been F.